I'm here with Kris Osborn. He's the founder and the editor-in-chief of RoundTable Warrior Maven, an expert on all things military defense. Kris, you've got your fingers in all kinds of pockets of from defense officials to military officials, analysts, and every day you read something in the press about China just becoming more and more aggressive around Taiwan. And from the outside, it looks like it's all just posturing. Like, oh, they're flying more planes in. They're moving into the South China Sea, whatever. Is it more than just trying to peacock feather?
Hey, Rob, great to be with you. Really interesting question. I think the prevailing consensus, and it may be evolving more in this direction now, is that there's a really significant and quite serious, a steadfast interest on the part of China to ultimately annex and create their one China policy, to basically take over Taiwan. Not long ago, the thinking was perhaps it was longer term. However, with the advent of hypersonics, the size of their Navy, and some of the current climate in terms of the geopolitical environment, they may think now is our best option, particularly with the U.S. leaving Afghanistan was one factor among many others. So they may think that they might be capable or well positioned to go take it now.
So I want to jump into the specifics on that, but first, when you say might be shorter term, take it now, does that mean like in the next 3 months or in the next 3 years? What is now for China's got a real long-term view of things. What might now be? Are we looking at something that could happen in 2 weeks? Obviously, that'd be a little thing.
Well, I like what you said about long-term view, because a lot of the Pentagon reports talk about the Chinese ambition of by 2049, the centennial, the 100-year mark of the founding of the PRC, they'll be the global dominant power. And there may be some thinking, this is a conjecture or just thinking out loud on my part, they may move earlier because of this pace of their modernization and perhaps the thought that it might be achievable. And the notion of, the previous notion of perhaps allowing for a somewhat autonomous Taiwan is disintegrated according to the Pentagon. Or to a large degree.
So what are officials saying though? Just on the time frame thing, 2049's almost 30 years away. Clearly, people are going. They might do some. I mean, with all this military presence that they're showing, they might do something. What in the next year while Biden's still president?
Well, it's interesting. There's no real guarantee of exactly what they would do when. What you hear is there is an uptick in provocative behavior. They conduct amphibious assault drills near Taiwan. They're overloading the Taiwanese air zone with fighter jets and different kinds of assets from the air. They're conducting war operations and even dual carrier drills to kind of copy the U.S. Navy. They're now second aircraft carrier being operational in the sense of a higher up-tempo, a higher sortie rate if you have to project power from the air. But the Chinese wouldn't have to travel far. They're 100 miles from the coast. So depending on where you take off within mainland China, you can get there even with or even without a tanker and make air attacks.
So how quickly do some officials, legit military officials, think China could, if they did want to be aggressive and make a move? I mean, again, I think to the public, it's like, oh, well, this has been going on forever. Is this something they worry like this? Again, I'm going to push for a time frame, not that you know exactly, but they worry in the next year it would be conceivable China could just decide, hey, let's just do it. Let's just put troops on the ground.
I'm thinking that there probably is this thought that something could be imminent and there is a need to be ready. That's certainly what you hear when you talk about the increased aggression, when you talk about the provocative behavior, and when you talk about the finding of missile silos on mainland China, the pace at which they intend to continue expanding their nuclear arsenal, the pace at which they're constructing and doing shipbuilding and adding new amphibs and carriers, and then, of course, the pace at which they're also producing fifth-generation fighter jets. So the time frame is something the U.S. and the Pentagon talks about a lot. We want to quicken our own developmental curve so we can match them in terms of numbers and retain our technical superiority. So
right.
Certainly the idea is to be prepared for the contingency. No one knows what they'll do or when they would do it, but certainly the Pentagon wants to be ready.
Last question on this, though. How quickly could China act because they're so close? Is this something that they could literally, if they decided tomorrow we want to do this, they could move in a month? Are they that capable, readiness-wise?
Well, you certainly raised a key point because it was addressed by the Pentagon report on China which is you seem to anticipate what that thinking was, which is the notion of a fait accompli, the idea of could China annex Taiwan so quickly, ultimately establish an on-the-ground presence and annex the area so as to make it too costly for any kind of counterattack. So it raises the question of could the U.S. and Taiwanese forces intervene early enough, fast enough? Could they see an impending attack early enough to stop? A lot of the conventional thinking is they most likely, they probably would not be able to stop a rapid takeover of the island. I don't know. That's sort of an interesting question.
So,
I mean, it depends on how close the Navy is, which is why you see carrier presence, which is why you see drones, which is why you see so much activity in the U.S. in the area. They might be able to stop it.
So I guess then the sort of the first issue in what you are writing about is there's the option of can we deter what you just said from happening? Can we keep China from deciding, hey, let's make a move quick and annex it, right? So that's the deterrence option. Whatever we do makes them decide we're not going to make a move. Are we sufficiently deterring? And do top military officials think we're not doing enough to send that message to China, like, don't even try?
Well, what's interesting is a Navy official once said when it comes to nuclear-armed submarines, it's to send a message, don't even think about it, to a potential nuclear attack, which is there is this counterattack, this catastrophic response possibility. But to answer your question, yeah, I think the idea is it has to be deterrence in part because of this fait accompli prospect, the cost and the effort required to actually extract an embedded Chinese force from the island of Taiwan would be very, very high. It doesn't mean it wouldn't be taken on. So I think the hope would be that the deterrence would be sufficient enough, and there are several key ways that this happens. One is a massive naval presence. You have a huge portion of the U.S. Navy based within what they call the Pacific Fleet. Years ago, the Pentagon began to migrate what they call the Pacific Pivot to recognize the dawn or the advent or the continuation, rather, of the great power era and be in position to respond. So you heard the Navy Secretary, the four P's, people, perseverance, presence. That's one of the key things is to be there, which is why in recent months the U.S. Navy has conducted dual carrier drills. They have carrier strike groups, what they call the Fleet, which is the Pacific Theater. They also run destroyers through FONOPs, or Freedom of Navigation operations, through the South China Sea to essentially make the point your territorial claims and your phony island building is essentially not legitimate under international convention, so we are going to demonstrate that the U.S. will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law permits.
So are we, though, I guess, I keep pushing I know you don't have a crystal ball, but, you wrote that everyone from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to the Army Chief of Staff, the Air Force Chief of Staff, Charles Brown, and others talked about China's a seriously and quote pacing threat. What does that mean, a pacing threat? Meaning they're speeding up and we're not keeping pace, or we are keeping pace?
Well, I think the recognition is the pace of military modernization and the sheer mass and the speed at which they are expanding is of great concern to the Pentagon. And that's why I don't think it's an accident you hear all of these senior leaders using that terminology, pacing threat. Just today, there was a fascinating think tank event, and Dr. Griffin, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, spoke specifically about hypersonics. There is widespread recognition that China is ahead of the U.S. in terms of deployable hypersonic weapons right now. So the question Dr. Griffin raised was, what if China, through conventional hypersonic weapon superiority, had the ability to essentially hold at bay any Western force from coming close enough for fear of being eliminated by a salvo of high-speed hypersonic weapons? And so that could present a tactical and strategic dynamic for the West to consider should they want to confront China. Should there be this imbalance when it comes to hypersonic capability, which is why the U.S. is closing the gap quickly.
So I think one of the things that I'm going to guess most conventional thinking has been, I don't mean from top military planners, I just mean average intelligent informed person goes, look, nobody wants a nuclear war. Nobody's stupid enough to want to decimate half the planet. So China's not going to do something that would force them and us or anyone else into a nuclear combat. And therefore, deterrence will prevent this from happening. And
Yes,
I counter that, before you answer, I counter that with But is China probably not already thought of that and gone, yeah, we're not gonna escalate to a nuclear war. We are going to do whatever we do and win without needing to escalate there, because we know the other side doesn't want to escalate there either. So if the option is have a nuclear war, everyone's going to be like, sorry, Taiwan.
Well, that's exactly what Dr. Griffin said. If there were this hypersonic weapons imbalance, the U.S. would be faced with going nuclear, which, of course, they wouldn't ever want to consider it as any kind of first strike, although the possibility of that often gets debated.
But Chris, we would never do that. Let's be honest. If Taiwan's getting taken over by the Chinese, we're not going to go nuclear. It's just not going to happen.
I'm not suggesting that we would. I agree. I'm not suggesting we would. The whole point is the paradox of nuclear weapons is to keep the peace, so that doesn't ever have their weapons designed and built with the intent of never being used. Now, to answer your question about deterrence, that's quite key, because one of the key dynamics that I think gets under-recognized is the air supremacy element here. The U.S. Air Force is planning to acquire 1,700 F-35s. Japan is making a multi-billion-dollar F-35 buy. Australia has F-35s. The U.S. has significant power and significant superiority when it comes to air. China, according to many reports, only has about 20 to 50 J-20 aircraft, which are fifth-generation equivalents. So if the U.S. can base enough forward-positioned aircraft or have amphibious assault vehicles, which can carry up to 15 F-35Bs, in the area in close enough proximity with enough warning they can get there, the Chinese would likely have a very hard time establishing air superiority, which they would have to have. The real threat is their amphibious force and their Navy, because their Navy is now larger than the U.S. Now, does that make them more capable, more sophisticated, better at war? Who knows? A lot of the thinking is no way. Also, the U.S. would have to get there fast enough and be in position. So the whole idea would be surveillance and ISR, get early word of a possible invasion, get naval assets in place, get your fifth-generation aircraft in place so that you can actually stop any kind of attack from an amphibious attack and establish that air superiority. I think the U.S. would be well positioned with its NATO allies and its Quad allies, its Pacific allies, to in effect stop the success or the potential success of an amphibious assault by using air power.
So, sort of the last step. Let's say China does make a move. We don't sufficiently defer. We don't have sufficient deterrence. So our deterrence is inadequate. China moves quickly. They're 100 miles away, and they make a move to annex Taiwan, put troops quickly on the ground, have air power, naval power to kind of back that up, hoping to keep everyone else at bay. In that scenario, what happens? At that point, what does the U.S., Japan, what does anybody at that point do? Now we failed to deter, and they're moving. What would realistic options be?
Well, the interesting thought is along the lines of what you suggested earlier. If Taiwan had, say, enough heavy armor on the ground or some Abrams tanks to slow down any kind of beachhead assault or arrival, and U.S. Navy officials had early warning of a possible attack, they could be in position to thwart, challenge, or essentially preclude any successful takeover. If there was, as you suggest, a possible takeover, that raises a fascinating and interesting question. If you look at a website like globalfirepower.com, they list the number of available troops that the U.S. has in the Pacific, as well as all the different allies in the region. And it was fascinating to learn that South Korea has its 2 to 3 million reserve soldiers, likely for the DMZ to stop a potential North Korean invasion. Japan has as many as 1 million potentially available soldiers. Australia much less, more like 60,000. But the idea of getting a land force assembled and having the air superiority to then have an amphibious response counterattack would be extremely challenging. China has as many as 2 million active duty soldiers. So if they had boots on the ground there, any kind of assault would likely start with long-range ballistic missiles. If they're 100 miles from coast, they could easily target a bunch of areas in Taiwan. Taiwan has fixed air defense sites around the perimeter, and it's likely to be followed by an air-sea kind of amphibious attack if they could establish air superiority, which I think is a very tall order given the presence of U.S. fifth-generation jets, if they can get there fast enough. And when it comes to dislodging a potential land force, that's an incredible question, because you talk about things like heavy armor, they are very hard to deploy. Remember the Gulf War, the months of staging. You have to get heavy assets in position to be deployed. which is why you see this big push on the part of the Army to be more expeditionary, airdropped airdropped light tanks, for example, expeditionary combat vehicles. So the hope would be to use long-range sensors, long-range weapons. Of course, you use those to soften the defenses on the perimeter and see if you can somehow get on the beach. And if you can land on Taiwan, then maybe you can create a corridor for all of those millions of Japanese, South Korean, and U.S. troops to get there.
That is although a real long shot, right? Once China passes deterrence, it's a ugly mess with a lot of casualties.
Oh, no doubt. And it's that cost that's likely why the U.S. is concerned about this fait accompli question and very forward-leaning about the question of deterrence. Part of why you see so many fifth-generation assets. You see drones. You see naval patrols happening in large measure over there. You see Japan building up and becoming a stronger ally.
Chris, when you say fifth-generation assets, what are you referring to?
The U.S. has the F-35, a fifth-generation stealth air fighter. The F-22 is also the fastest in the world, many believe. It's considered fifth-generation as well. It means they're stealthy. The F-35 is multi-role, meaning it can perform ISR, drone-like surveillance, as well as even close air support with its 25-millimeter cannon, and then, of course, has the speed and the precision air attack sufficient to go against and defeat enemy air defenses. At least that's the thinking. Now, China has in recent years sought to match the U.S. fifth-generation superiority with two aircraft. One is the J-20. That's been around for a little while. That is a stealth aircraft believed to be fifth generation. The big question is, how sophisticated are the mission systems, the computing, the fire control, the weapons? That's really the largest margin of difference. And I have no idea if it's in any way comparable to the point where it could challenge a U.S. F-35, which is widely believed and understood, certainly by many in the Western world, as one of the most advanced, capable fighters in the world.
Does our military have an idea to that question of how, is that sort of an unknown? We don't know how sophisticated their systems are.
As far as the internal avionics and computing, I wouldn't have any idea.
No, I'm saying, does our military have an idea, or is that something we probably don't know either?
I don't know. They might. It certainly would make sense to me if there were an understanding of that, given it's the information warfare, the speed of processing information, finding and eliminating targets before you yourself are seen, is the whole premise upon multi-domain warfare and information-driven future war. The four-star Army commander of Army Futures Command told me they all anticipate the future battlefield to be hyperactive. So speed of information flow is really the paradigm-changing element of what's being emphasized at the Pentagon. So China also has the J-31, and they're developing a carrier-launched variant. That, by any just observer's eye, looks like an F-35 ripoff. And so there's a lot of concern that several years after a really successful U.S. platform emerges, sure enough, something from China emerges several years later that has some similarities. Nonetheless, the J-31 is a carrier-launched variant. They only have two carriers. They can't launch them from amphibs because they're not vertical takeoff. The U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy and other allies have the F-35B, which is a vertical takeoff and landing fifth-generation aircraft, which you can deploy from an amphib. So not only will you have carriers, but you can also have numerous amphibs. USS America, the first-in-class next-generation amphibious assault ship, is already deployed with as many as 13 F-35s on board. So if you can put that kind of fifth-generation air power in spades and mass, because mass still matters. Many talk about Sun Tzu, and despite all the technology, you're going to need numbers in the air to maintain and establish that superiority. It's that fifth-generation margin of difference. The Chinese don't have, at least as far as I know, any kind of vertical takeoff fifth-generation plane. And their J-31, which is nascent pretty early on, is a carrier-launched aircraft, but there's no indication that could compete with an F-22 or an F-35.
So last question for you, and I push you to try to make a prediction. I know you don't like to predict, but I think it's important. It's not. I'm not holding you to it, but is China ultimately intends to take Taiwan? That is not in their mind negotiable. That either happens peacefully because Taiwan simply says okay, or it happens because China uses sufficient threat and or use of military force to make it happen. Is it fair to say China fully intends to execute on that one way or the other in the relatively near term? I don't mean months, but I mean that's not optional in their eyes. And given that, Given that, is it fair to assume at some point, whether it's 5 years or whatever, they're going to do something? Because Taiwan's not going to just fold up and go, okay, and they're going to do something to force this issue. And it will, and I guess what I'm saying is it will involve military action. Whether there's a conflict or not, it's not going to happen by a handshake. It's going to happen by a massive use of force, a threat of force. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I think the prevailing wisdom and what you see in the Pentagon reports, the Pentagon China report specifically said they might try something like a blockade. So to cut off the area and force a major confrontation and force us or the U.S. and the West and its allies to think this is just too costly, right? The whole fait accompli notion. I would suggest that given the uptick in tensions and the uptick in activity, there's, of course, the potential element of posturing here, but certainly the significance of Chinese intent to take over Taiwan is not lost on the Pentagon, and I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't serious concerns that it could be much closer term than had been thought of previously.
All right, well, that's scary but true, as we say.
That's why there's the big push for deterrence, and that has to work, which is why we see the Navy doing drills and doing all the way through the Pacific. U.S. Pacific Command only has 106,000 or so U.S. personnel based there. However, its maritime power, its undersea power, its surface power, and its allied power, which is why you see such a growing participation from South Korea, Japan, Australia. That collective effort would be very formidable, it seems to me, just looking at numbers and being familiar with what writes in its newspapers and what we have, would favor the West, it would seem to me.
Well, listen, a great conversation, and I think the average person looks at this as like, I'm guessing this may be a great example where our military and defense, department and analysts and intelligence community is very aware this is not just this is not a passive threat. This is something they see as very real and very likely to happen at some point.
Well, you said it exactly right. I'd like to say one quick thing, if I could, about submarines. Thinking about how a Chinese amphibious assault could be stopped. Just thinking about it. I mean, I know we mentioned air power, but what about submarines? The Virginia-class attack submarines are increasingly engineered for more undersea clandestine surveillance kinds of missions. If you can't detect a submarine, then it can stay in closer proximity, be able to see the early signs of, or even track and attack an amphibious assault before it can reach the shore. And something like an undersea submarine might not be detected by the Chinese Navy, whereas a surface fleet of a carrier group or something like a group of destroyers, while formidable and very important, they would be seen or known most likely by satellites or overhead surveillance. So you have new attack class submarines that are engineered with next generation antennas, different kinds of coding materials, and quieting technologies. So the attack submarines, which are heavily armed with tomahawks, can inflict a massive amount of damage, are also increasingly capable of surveillance. So if you have them able to operate quietly beneath the surface along those high-risk coastal areas, who knows? I mean, obviously for understandable security reasons, you don't hear where they are, but certainly the possibility of submarines playing a key role in stopping an ultimate invasion made sense to me just thinking about it.
Sure. Well, listen, again, great conversation. Like I said, I don't see us geared up for a military conflict with China. I think China knows that. We don't have the public will to go. We don't want to start a massive war with China. It's not, and they know that. And I think that's where you're right. Deterrence and surveillance that might give us that deterrence is what it's all about. Kris Osborn, Warrior Maven, always great to talk to you about this stuff.
Pleasure, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.